Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and cryptids encounter horror stories. First story, the Wendigo. She was an old woman and was always asleep by 8. Before bed, she took her pills, drank some water, and used the bathroom. Then the lights went out, and she fell asleep with her dog, Kvar. Hers was a house of nighttime rituals. She was prideful about this, since not many women her age of 112 could keep a schedule. However, unbeknownst to her, she was not the only one in the house with daily procedures. It was about 15 after 1. Kvar wriggled out from under her covers as stealthily he could, and slowly lowered himself off of her bed. Once on the floor, he quietly crept over to the door. He looked back at her in order to assure himself that she was asleep, and then once he was absolutely sure, he stood up on his 2 hind legs. His paws morphed in a more humanoid, yet not human form, and he slowly opened the door. He exited the room in silence and crept down the stairs, where he made his final exit out of the front door. Once outside of the house, he ran through the yard, and through the fences he ran, and kept running until he entered the forest at the end of the pasture, at which point he returned to all fours so as to not scare any of the creatures there. It was about half an hour before he was able to catch the rabbit. He grabbed it by its head and quickly shook back and forth, breaking its neck. With that done, he returned back to his natural form and walked slowly to the stump hidden deep in the forest. The stump once belonged to his dearly departed father, Ingvar. It was not made by Ingvar. Rather, it was given to him for the same purpose he himself gave it to Kvar. Kvar gently placed the rabbit onto the stump. He then walked to a tree nearby with a hole on its side, and out of that hole he pulled an obsidian dagger. Upon his return to the rabbit, he wasted no time. He outstretched his arms and began to speak. Alleluia secundus. Alleluia seconds. He screamed. He waited. He waited. He waited for the whisper, the approval of the elder gods, but he did not hear it. Alleluia secundus. Alleluia secundus. Alleluia secundus. No response. An impending sense of doom filled him, foreshadowing what he felt could be the end of his joy. And so he returned to all fours and once again caught a rabbit. He slammed it down next to the other, and once more, with all of his might, screamed the holy words, Alleluia secundus. Alleluia secundus. Alleluia secundus. Alleluia secundus. And the moon whispered back, Melodia secunda. He gulped and smiled. He began to pant, and a tear left his eye. It was done. The old woman would live another day. But no matter how happy this made him tonight, gave an ominous message. The price is increasing. Second story. The worst shrooms trip of all time. Frigid air outside. Height of the Canadian winter. Going out to the bars would have been nothing short of a nightmare, but we still wanted something to do. So when Jack brought out a small plastic bag filled with those dried caps and stems, I admit I got a bit excited. What would you guys do without me? He said, grinning. I replied, fair enough. This time he could have his dues. After all, he'd saved us from another stale weekend of drinking cheap beer and watching horror movies in my basement. I brought out the scale, and Jack doled it out. 3 grams each, save for Lisa, whom we gave 1.5 to since it'd be her first time. I didn't bother asking Jack where he'd gotten them from, because I knew he'd been using the same dealer for years, a reliable enough guy who ranked on the lower end when it came to sketchiness. That's why when Jack told me he'd switched up his source, I felt something of a jolt at my side. It wasn't that I didn't trust the guy, but shit happens. Dan said he was done with it, Jack explained. Gave me this new guy's contact. He didn't seem like a weirdo when I met up with him. Aren't shrooms like borderline legal anyway? Sure, I said. Likely it'd be inconsequential. I mean, it tasted about the same as anything I'd had in the past. Still, we made sure one of us, Brown, remained sober just in case. The five of us, Jack, Brown, Lisa, Amber, and myself, went about commencing our night. For the first hour, we mostly just sat, drinking, smoking a bit. Not too much. Then came the giggles. Whatever came out of Jack's mouth seemed to warrant prolonged bouts of raucous laughter, and most of it wasn't even funny in the slightest. We talked about life, about our jobs, relationships, aspirations, memories, theories about aliens, dinosaurs, the origins of the universe, trying so hard to blow each other's minds. So far, it was looking to be a good trip. About 2 hours passed before anything of concern happened, and it started with Lisa. "Jesus Christ," she said. "Are you guys seeing shit?" I looked around. "Not really," I said. "What do you see?" For a while she stayed silent, and I watched as she lowered the can of beer she was drinking and placed it down onto the table in front of her. She shook her head. "What the fuck?" she muttered. I followed her stare and looked up at one of the corners of the ceiling. "Nothing." "What do you see?" I repeated. Again, no answer. She just stared. Soon her mouth fell open. I looked around at the others, who just looked back and shrugged. You see, crazy hallucinations aren't exactly a trademark of shrooms. Sometimes you'll look at a painting and the lines will be a bit funky. Maybe you'll see a few swirls in the ceiling. Anything beyond that, and maybe you got to start asking yourself what exactly it is you've just taken. Brown laughed. "Amber, come on. You got to tell us what you're seeing." Slowly, she closed her mouth and sat back, enveloping herself in the couch. She looked down at her lap and shook her head again. I don't know," she said softly, before stealing one more glance at the ceiling. "It's gone now." The mood in the room certainly took a hit after that. In order to lighten things up, Brown put on some Netflix stand-up comedy. More laughs followed. Eventually, Lisa joined in as well. Back to normalcy. Still curious about her earlier ordeal, I kept my eyes on her, watching as her rigid demeanor slowly melted away into something more jovial. But after a few jokes that landed flat, her gaze began to wander away from the screen and back up to the ceiling. Never before had I seen anybody's eyes bulge out so wide in ostensible horror so quickly. She looked she wanted to scream, but the only thing that came out was something like a stifled gasp. She reached for the television remote, grabbed it, and flung it at the ceiling before pulling a blanket over her head and turning to the side. Underneath it, I could hear her sobbing softly. "Lisa, what the hell?" Brown yelled out. He turned to me. "Dude, she just cracked your walls." I looked up. Indeed, the wall, right under where the ceiling began, had been damaged. The remote laid on the floor beneath with its batteries spilled out. But for obvious reasons, that wasn't my biggest concern at the moment. I looked back at Lisa, still shivering under the covers. "Lisa, what was it?" I asked. "What did you see?" When she didn't answer, I moved over and gently pulled the blanket down from her face. Immediately, she covered her eyes with her hands. "What was it?" She shook her head. "I can still see it," she said. "Jesus Christ, Jack," Amber exclaimed. "What the hell did you give us?" Jack put his hands up in a defensive gesture. "Nothing we haven't taken a dozen times before. If it's from a different dealer, how can you be sure?" Brown added. "Look," Jack continued, "it's her first time. My first trip wasn't so fucking great either." He got up, walked over to Lisa. "Hey, Lise, you okay? I'll sit with you, all right? I'll talk you through this." He reached down and pulled her hands away. "Look, it'll be all right. We're all here. Your friends are here." She tilted her head up, revealing a face stained with tears, but her eyes remained shut. She mumbled something, What? Jack asked. Why? Your shoulder? What? It's looking at me, over your shoulder. Jack sighed, let go of her hands. Immediately, they went back to covering her eyes. Fucking hell, he said. I'm gonna have to kick this dealer's ass next time I see him. He looked at me, then at Amber. You guys see or feel anything weird? Amber shook her head. I considered it for a moment. I was definitely high, but it was about as mild as a trip could get. Maybe it really was a first-time thing, I thought. Jack walked back to the couch he was sitting on, ran his hands through his hair. We just gotta stay with her and wait till it wears off. Then he laughed. Boy, wait till Dan hears about this. He's gonna flip shit. Some more time passed without incident. I wasn't sure how long. Lisa had stopped crying, but it was still a bit unnerving sitting next to her while she kept her hands practically glued to her eyes. Every now and then we'd try and say something comforting to her. It was unclear whether or not it ever helped. At some point, Jack went to the washroom. Instead of sitting back down when he came out, he stood over the couch and looked around the room, his face contorted and his nose scrunched up as if he were standing right in the heart of a landfill. Tell me I'm not the only one who smells that, he said. Make sure you turn the fan on, I replied. Not that, he said. What? None of you smell it? I looked up at him. What are we supposed to be smelling? My question was answered as soon as I asked it. No gradual build-up. 1 second there was nothing, and then suddenly it was all around me. I'm not sure how to describe it. Not quite like rotting meat, but just about as unpleasant. Something sharp and pungent, but also strangely unfamiliar to anything that I knew. I got up, took a few steps forward, and the scent lessened. A few seconds later, and it was back in full force. I looked at Jack, but he was already looking at me. No, not at me. Behind me. Sean, he spat out. I shook my head. I know. Don't say it. It wasn't just the smell anymore. There was also a presence. That feeling you get when somebody's standing uncomfortably close behind you. My heart started beating like a drum. Well, Amber said, standing up, you guys are freaking me out. I'm gonna go lay down in the other room. I could have told her that was a bad idea, but at that moment, the words weren't able to come out. Brown looked between us, visibly confused. Never in my life had I heard about shrooms yielding olfactory hallucinations, aka fake smells. Yet it was happening now. But that's all it was, right? Hallucinations. They weren't real. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and turned around. Nothing. The smell was gone as well. Jack let out a sigh of relief. I looked at him. What was it? He shook his head. I don't know. The hell do you mean? I don't know how to describe it. I swallowed. Like a creature or something? He nodded slowly. Something like that. For a while we just stood looking at each other, not quite sure how to register what had just happened. Then came a scream from the other room. Jack, Brown, and I made a beeline for it, only to find the door locked. Amber, we yelled. Another scream. Move, Brown said before backing up and ramming into it with his shoulder, his body going right through the wooden frame. We followed close behind, and as soon as we entered, the smell was back. No, I thought. There was a subtle difference about it. Almost the same as whatever I'd smelt before, but just slightly off. As I stumbled in, I could see Amber crouched in the corner, and for a split second I thought I'd seen something standing in front of her, some dark, blurry shape. Of course, it disappeared immediately, and the smell once again followed. What the hell happened? Brown asked. She looked up at us, wide-eyed pale. Fuck this, she said, and stormed for the washroom. She kneeled before the toilet and put a finger in her mouth and down her throat, gagging and gagging before out came a surge of vomit. She sighed. You guys should probably do the same, she said. I wasn't about to argue that. I went upstairs to the sink and vomited out what I could. In the bathroom next to me, I could hear Jack gagging. Once Amber had finished up, she helped Lisa do the same. When I came back down, Brown was pacing around. Jack, I'm gonna kick this dealer's ass myself, he said. Then he got up. Give me the fucking bag. Jack rinsed his mouth with some beer. Yeah, he said, and tossed it over to him. Brown caught it, placed it on the counter, and took out a few of the stems. For a while, he just looked at them. Do you still have your microscope? He asked me after a few minutes. Maybe, man, I don't know. Why? Where could it be? He asked. I shook my head. Checked the storage closet. Even though I'd puked out as much of the contents in my guts that I could have, the high was still there. Likely it was already too late to be purged out so easily. I looked over at Jack, who was sitting with his hands buried in his face. Then at Amber, who was holding a borderline catatonic Lisa close, trying to comfort her any way she could, although none of it seemed to be working. Brown came back momentarily with a microscope in hand. He set it down and blew off some of the dust that had accumulated over the years since I'd left university before picking up one of the stems and placing it onto the stage. Then he looked into the eyepiece and zoomed into it. What are you doing? I asked. No response. After a while, he breathed deeply. Son of a bitch, he muttered. He looked up and then at Jack. You son of a bitch, he said. What, man? Jack replied. Brown marched towards him, grabbed him by the collar of his sweater, and dragged him over to the counter. Take a look, he said. Jack jerked free from his grip. Jesus, man, all right. He bent down and pressed his eye to the lens. Seconds later, he vomited again, all over the floor. He wiped his mouth and fell back. What the fuck? What the fuck? I turned to Brown, and he gestured for me to come take a look as well. I already knew that I wasn't going to like what I was about to see, and I was right. Even at maximum magnification, they were small, but they were there. Lined all the way up and down the stem were eyes. There must have been dozens, all different colored irises, blinking, staring blankly back at me. I began to taste the vomit as well. After a while, Amber also looked. She didn't say anything. Really, none of us knew what to say, because we knew things were only going to get worse. Jack took out his phone. I'm calling this mother F, he said. And what's that going to do? Brown asked. You going to rat him out to the police? No, I'm going to find out what it is that he sold me. By now, we should have been reaching the peak of our high, and I could feel as much. If you haven't experienced it before, then I'm not sure how to describe it, but know that the factors separating a bad trip from a good one are one's state of mind and the environment around them. And in circumstances like these, that could only spell out disaster. I took a deep breath, trying hard not to let panic flood my system. I put my headphones in, played some upbeat music. That seemed to help slightly. But then the smell came back. It was fainter this time, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere up and to the side of me, right near that corner of the ceiling. Trust me when I say that I didn't want to look, but how could I not? Slowly, I turned my head, and there it was, clinging to the walls and the ceiling, some diabolical thing looking right down at me. I couldn't tell how many limbs it had upon first glance. 8, maybe 10. A human-like torso, spider-like legs. A ghoulish head that hung low. Save for a pair of bright, beady eyes, there was no color to it, its body constituted completely by a stark absence of light. Soon the rest were looking at it as well. What were we supposed to do? How could we react? Whatever you're seeing, it's not real, Brown said. Just ignore it. Ignore it. He couldn't have known how hard that was. That thing stayed up there, just staring at me for a long while before it disappeared, crawling into the ceiling. I kept my eyes glued to that spot, waiting for it to return. Then the smell came back, closer now, coming from below me. I didn't look down. Instead, I backed up and away. Brown was right, I told myself. Just ignore it. But easier said than done. Because 1 minute later, Lisa was screaming bloody murder. And once again, the source of her fright was a mystery to the rest of us. We all looked around, seeing no creatures present at the moment. This time, though, we held no doubt that something was there. A few seconds later, and she was bolting up the stairs. We raced up to catch her, but it was too late. She'd already run out into the cold of the night. I don't know how long we spent chasing after her, but it was long enough for the freezing air to start nipping at my skin. In the end, none of us were able to reach her. I couldn't tell you how she was able to run as fast as she did, but it happened. I bent down, wheezing for breaths before looking up to see her disappearing into a turn down the street. I turned around and saw the others some meters behind me, equally exhausted. I stumbled over to them. "We have to call the cops," I said. Jack's teeth chattered. "Shouldn't we drive around and look for her first? It'll take too much time. We have to call them now." No further objections. I took out my phone, dialed 911, and passed it off to Brown, who spoke to them. 10 minutes, he said, and handed the phone back to me. We began walking back, and I forced myself to keep my eyes forward, because I could see them. They were standing in the spaces between houses, some larger than others. I never tried getting a good look at any of them. Once I noticed that they seemed to be getting closer, I began to run, and the rest soon followed. By the time we got back to my own house, the cops were already there and waiting. They came inside and we explained the situation. Then they set off to look for her, with Amber and Brown riding along in the back seat. Jack and I just sat in my kitchen, silent, listening to my clock tick in the empty air. I clenched my hands. Lisa hadn't run when she saw that first creature. So why did she run now? What did she see, and how could it have been so much worse? Logic dictated that whatever she'd seen, we'd be seeing soon as well. But it didn't matter, because they weren't real. Of course they weren't real. How could they be? I watched as Jack picked up the bag and looked around, apparently thinking about hiding it somewhere. Then he set it back down where it was, likely realizing that sooner or later, the cops were going to know about it, and sooner would probably land us in less trouble. For now, all we could was wait. Wait and hope we'd see nothing else. Of course, that was wishful thinking. It didn't take long. Maybe about a few minutes after the cops had left. There was no smell this time, no warning of what was to come. It was tall and clad in some kind of sweeping robe, its back hunched as to clear way for its head, which appeared to be contained within a rusted cage that was tight against its skull, causing its charred skin to poke out from the spaces between the bars while its eyes drooped out of their sockets and swung about in front as it looked down at us. It appeared so fast. I blinked once, and there it was in the corner opposite to us. I blinked again, and then there were more. Then there were 3. Had they been there the whole time? Or only now was I able to see them? Even if they were hallucinations, Lisa had run for a reason. I kept that thought in the back of my mind. To call the next few minutes tense would have been an understatement. The robed creatures stood where they were, swaying just slightly around, while the 2 of us remained seated, too petrified to move. Slowly shifting my eyes, I considered the distance between us and the creatures, along with us and the door. They were in the far end of the living room. We were in the middle of the kitchen. The door was closer to us. "Dude," I heard Jack mutter. "The ceiling, look at the ceiling." I looked up. White specks were falling down from the points where their heads were grinding against it. For a moment I was confused. "What about it?" I asked. Then the realization washed over me like freezing ocean waves. Those subtle scraping noises, something that my brain had written off as logical at first, had now become thunderous. Now we had a choice. Brave it until the cops came back around, or make a run for it. Moving as little as I could, I reached into my pockets. No keys. They were back downstairs. "I have mine," Jack said. "Are we going to do it?" I didn't respond. I didn't know. After a while, one of the creatures lurched slightly forward, and that's when I bolted up from my seat and ran. Swinging open the door, I almost hit Jack in the face. But he was out. We were both out. And so were the creatures. We could hear them behind us, their stomps heavy, their cages rattling around. They're croaking. God, that croaking. Once we'd made it into his vehicle, he started the engine and sped away so fast that we nearly swerved into the curb. By the time he'd gotten things under control, we could hear the banging against his trunk. But we got away. As we drove, I asked him where we were going. "Dan won't pick up my calls," he said, gripping the wheel tight. "So I'm going to ask him a few questions in person." I could feel the hairs standing tall on the back of my neck during the entire drive over. About 5 minutes in, something appeared in the back seat. After 10, it was joined by something else. I didn't look. I forced myself not to look. Sometimes they'd also be there in the back seats of the cars that passed us. Some were standing on the sidewalks. Some stood on the road in front of us, and Jack carefully swerved to avoid them. Most of the time, there was this one creature, humanoid, wrapped in bandages like a mummy, bearing large, clawed hands that he ran over without hesitation. I could feel the impact, and it left a large crack on the windshield. When I looked over at him, he was pale, his expression like stone. I asked why he'd done that. "I had to," he said. "I had to." At one point, I felt something touch my shoulder. Closing my eyes, I reached for the water bottle sitting in his front cup holder. Then I turned around and flung it into the back seat. A hoarse whimper. I'd hit something. It was strange. Even though my eyes were closed, I could still see it. More accurately, the outline of it was palpable through the patterns in the dark. It was a feeble thing, some toddler-sized larvae creature with stick-like appendages. Even stranger was that I could sense it wasn't a threat. There was an aura around it, something heavily contrasting what I'd felt from those robed creatures. Still, I didn't want it around me. I didn't want it in my world. After 20 minutes, we pulled up at a modest property nestled away at the very end of some suburban street. Jack stopped the car, and we scanned our surroundings. Silent. Still. Then we got out and walked up to the front door. Jack knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, louder. "Dan," he yelled. Nothing still. Then he tried the door, and it was unlocked. Cautiously he entered, and I followed right behind. The living room was empty, normal looking. The bedroom was a different story. Clothes and papers were strewn around. A computer monitor was smashed and face down on the desk. Blood was on the floor, bullet holes in the walls. On some of the papers, I could see symbols drawn, strangely detailed and utterly alien. Jack shook his head. "Shit, what about the other guy? The new dealer?" I asked. "No clue where he lives, and I doubt he's going to answer my calls." For a while we stood silent. Then we walked out into the living room and sat down. I grabbed a knife. Jack held a bat, and we waited. Before we knew it, the sun had risen. "It's worn off, isn't it?" I finally asked, breaking the silence which had persisted for so long. Jack nodded. "Yeah." I checked my phone. No calls from either the police, Brown, or Amber. I called them back. No answer. I felt a pit forming in my stomach. We walked out into the morning light and towards his car, and I saw that there were dents in his trunk and that the crack on his windshield was still there. Neither of us commented on it. He drove me back to my house and then went off on his own way. It's been days since then, and I still haven't heard from the police. Or Brown. Or Amber. Or Lisa. Just yesterday, some men in suits came and knocked at my door. They said that they know what happened to me, that they just wanted to talk. But I don't trust them. I know what they're really here for, and I know they'll be back, and next time they won't bother knocking. Jack never came back for the bag, and I've kept it in one of my drawers. I know that I should have flushed it down the toilet. No, I should have thrown it into a furnace. But I've kept it around, and I know why I have, because I have a feeling that it might be the only way I'll ever see my friends again. Third story. Live my scariest experience to date for a homework. I've always been really into ghost stories, or urban legends in general. The White Lady, haunted dolls, vampires, black-eyed children, that kind of stuff. I know that today, people my age aren't big fans of that kind of horror anymore, preferring it things like the backrooms, analog horror, all the new kinds of scary media. Honestly, I get it. Things do need to evolve, and when we see everything that's happening in the world, it's understandable that a good old ghost story don't do the job anymore. Still, the old-fashioned horror, it's not that old, but things move fast on the internet, is always my jam. I grew up watching YouTubers investigating haunted places, ghost hunting with all their accessories, EMF meters, their little radio thing that they use to listen to radio frequencies so that they can hear any interference, their antenna that beeps when something approaches it, voice recorders, special flashlights, and let me tell you that all this, it was doing it for me. So, since my probably 7 years, I dreamt of doing these things myself. Of course, I tried everything a young boy is able to do, like Ouija or stupidly walking around my house with my phone filming, hoping that some random deceased person with unfinished business will show up to, I don't know, have a chat. I wish I could say that other people's judgment doesn't affect me, but that would be a lie. So, going into high school, I had to socially tone down my interest for those things in order to have friends. None of my friends and classmates knew about my persisting passion for ghosts and creepy stories. I realized that keeping this such a secret is a bit ridiculous, especially approaching my 18th birthday, but, it would be even weirder to reveal it after hiding it for almost 6 years like it was something super taboo. So here I started hiding my passion at 12 to avoid others judging it. And I'm now still hiding it at 17 to avoid others judging the fact that I hid it. A bit pathetic, I got to admit. Anyway, everything started a few days ago. I have an art history class at school, and the teacher really likes to give us big works of research. This time, he had a new idea. The whole class will be divided into groups of 2, and each group will receive a building from our city that the teacher had choose for his architectural and artistic interests, and we'll have to give it a visit and write an analysis on the different things we'll notice and link it to what we saw in class. Since all the buildings were not public places, he had asked the authorization of every property's owner. Honestly, this could have been worse. This actually sounded kind of cool to do. Now, what I was concerned about was who will be my partner. Obviously, I was hoping for one of my friends. After explaining the rules and exact instructions for the work, he started to announce the groups. I was waiting to hear my name, anxious, as all my friends were slowly starting to be put into their groups. Joshua, the teacher said, "Yeah, that's my name. You will be with," I was holding on to my chair. "Elizabeth." I turned to Elizabeth, and we looked at each other. Neither one of us seemed excited. It wasn't a terrible pair, I thought to myself. I just didn't know what to think of it exactly. Elizabeth was a pretty popular girl. Not that I was an outcast or anything, but she was still way more popular than me. I didn't know much more about her, despite the fact that we were in the same class since my first year of high school, but it looked like she was going to be an okay partner. The teacher then gave us our building. I won't reveal the real name of what he gave us, so I'll call it Guaraldi Street 22. Apparently, it was a pretty old house that had somewhat of an historic value to it. The teacher gave us some information so we wouldn't stumble there without any prior knowledge. The owner was an old woman who had always lived there. She was apparently very glad to open her doors to young students and was ready to answer any questions we could have. He warned us that she had a weak audition and that we would have to speak loudly. The teacher then recommended us to do a little bit of research before going there, so we could already have some idea of where we were entering. I then found myself in front of Elizabeth. I think the last time we even talked to each other was months ago, when she was distributing a test to the class and that I said thanks. So, yeah, not a lot of background. I noticed, and I don't know why it took me so long, I guess I never paid much attention to her, that she was dressed in kind of an old style. She wore some clearly used dungarees. The date the teacher had scheduled for our visit was on Sunday, and we were Thursday. So, I guess we can both do research on our side, and we'll meet, maybe at lunch break tomorrow to get on the same page. Is that good for you? She asked me. Yeah, that's good, we can do that. Okay then, see you tomorrow, she said. See you. On that she turned her feet and left for her break. The rest of the day went by, and I got back home. As usual, my mom wasn't there. She often has to work late as she's a single mom to me and my little sister Rosa. I ate my diner and went to my room. I opened my computer to start my research. It wasn't hard to find information, even though things were repeating themselves a lot. So much historical meaning for the city, a perfect example of Art Deco architecture, a house filled with stories. There was a lot of talk by local medias about it, but not much actual facts. It was so weak that I had to go to page 2 of the search results on Google, or as I like to call them, the abyss of the internet. I'm exaggerating a bit, but it's not often that you have to go there. Then something caught my eyes. It was a forum about paranormal experiences, and the address was mentioned on a post. I immediately clicked on it and read the whole thing. It wasn't exactly the most thrilling story I've read, but here's what it basically said. Apparently, the owner opened the house as a cottage during the summer, and the person posting was narrating what he experienced during his passage there. He described a very special and kind of suffocating vibe that was apparently all around the house, and the feeling of being observed all the time. He also talked about hearing voices at random moments. They were brief, but often mentioned his name. The end of his testimony talked about his last night, when he said he saw a little child with no facial expression in front of his bed, who slowly started to climb into it and grabbed his legs, trying to pull him outside of his bed. The poster said he eventually succeeded to push the kid away, despite his unreal strength, and that the boy ended up running out of the room, laughing. When he spoke to the owner about it the next morning, she said that it must have been his imagination playing tricks on him, as she didn't believe in paranormal and that nothing similar ever happened to her. This wasn't much. It could have been a complete lie, but I would be lying if I said it didn't pique my curiosity. The story was as basic as it could be, but it was so specific for it to happen in that place, which was absolutely not famous, and even less for any paranormal events. I kept that in the back of my mind and continued my research, but I didn't find much more, so I went to sleep. As I was lying in my bed, I was thinking, what if the person who posted his story said the truth? This was the first time I was going to enter somewhere that old and charged with history. This could be the perfect place for my first ghost hunt. But of course, I was going for school and won't be alone, plus, it's not really respectful to the owner, who kindly opened the doors of her family house to us. And even if I wanted to, I'd be constantly with Elizabeth, so it was not really an option. I looked at the EMF meter I received for a birthday on my shelf and thought to myself that this would be for another time. The next day, as planned, I met with Elizabeth at lunch break. We started to share the results of our research, where I did not include the post from the forum for obvious reasons. We talked a bit before coming to a clear conclusion. Yeah, the thing is, we have the same exact stuff. There isn't much interesting infos to be found online, except very surface level stuff. She said, yes, I think we should prepare the questions we want to ask the owner instead. I answered, "You're right. Do you think you can have yours for Sunday?" "Yeah, no problem." We exchanged a bit more and eventually went back to class. On Saturday, I prepared a few questions to ask the owner. Then came today, Sunday. The meeting was planned at 11 a.m. I woke up normally, took a breakfast, got dressed, everything. Before leaving my room, I took one last look at the room and I saw my EMF meter. It was like he was begging me to take him. I grabbed it and left. I didn't know if I would actually use it, but I had it. It had an option where instead of lighting the small lamps, he was vibrating. So I activated that and put it in my pocket. I arrived at the house, and Elizabeth was already waiting for me. We knocked, and we could hear the owner walking towards the door saying, "Yes, yes, just a second." She opened, and she looked like the sweetest thing ever. She was short and had a naturally kind face. We could see that she was clearly dressed and make up for the occasion. She welcomed us and let us in happily. The hallway was very pretty. I understood why our teacher got us this house. It was indeed very interesting. The walls were covered with paintings and old pictures, mostly portraits. On every one of these, the people had a very serious look, but that's not unusual for old pictures. We walked to the living room where she served us tea, and we sat together. "So, I think you have some questions for me?" she asked. You could see that she was very glad to talk. "Don't be shy, I'm open." Elizabeth started to ask her first question, then I did, and we could ask her everything. The house was her family's for many generations, but it hadn't always been theirs. All the persons in the hallway, paintings or pictures, were previous inhabitants of the house, and they went as far as the 15th century, so yeah, it was all pretty old. She said they could only know the identity of some of the first generations, but that a lot of the people were non-identified. She answered a lot of other questions regarding the architectural and artistic heritage of the building, and she was surprisingly very interesting to listen to. Her enthusiasm and kindness were contagious, and we both couldn't help but ask more questions. Eventually, we arrived at the end of our list, and it was time for us to visit, take notes, analyze all that. She asked us not to touch anything, as a lot of things had a lot of value, but let us wander free in the house. She said she'll be making cookies for when we'll be done. Elizabeth and I found ourselves alone in the living room and finished our tea. "God, she's adorable," said Elizabeth with a smile. "Yes, she's so sweet. I wasn't expecting that." I said, "Let's maybe start with there," she said, pointing to the room besides us. We got up and entered it. The walls were covered by huge bookshelves. Elizabeth started to take notes, looking at the room, and I started inspecting the books. There was probably more than 1,000 books, and some of them looked super old. I read the titles of some of them, and the least I could say was that it needed to be rearranged. Cooking Asian Food, Harry Potter, and the Half-Blood Prince, some old book with the title erased, and even a CD in the middle. It was a bit random. We eventually moved on to the hallway. It was a bit oppressing with all those eyes who seemed to observe us. Elizabeth did mention how it felt a bit weird, and we started to take notes again. At some point, my look stopped on one painting at the back of the hall. It was a young lady, dressed classically, maybe a bit poorly even, for someone who would have lived there. She was kind of pretty, if I'm being honest. But the reason why it caught my eyes was that it was the only one who was smiling. All the other people represented looked dead serious, but her, she smiled. A sweet, even caring and warm smile. I noticed that it seemed like she was staring at me. Of course, a lot of paintings give that same impression, but it was more intense on her. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure that I just saw her wink to me. I let out a gasp. I was convinced she winked at me. The vibe went from slightly oppressive to extremely heavy. Then we both heard it. "Elizabeth!" An unrecognizable voice had just whispered. Elizabeth turned to me. Did you say that? She asked. Elizabeth, a younger voice this time. We were facing each other, so we knew it couldn't be one of us this time, and the owner was in the kitchen. Elizabeth's eyes opened wide, and she slowly walked towards me. Elizabeth. She jumped. What the heck? I let out. We were looking around us. Joshua, I don't like this. Yeah, me neither. We were frozen in place with all the paintings looking right to us. Elizabeth, that time it was a deep voice, and it came from behind us. We turned. Slowly, all the faces of the paintings and pictures started to clearly move. They were opening their eyes wide and opening their mouths, maintaining their serious, and now even melancholic look. Holy shit, what the fuck is that? What is it? Elizabeth was mumbling, panicking as I was starting to breathe faster. All the people started to say her name together on repeat. Elizabeth, Elizabeth, Elizabeth. I turned my head to the painting of the young lady from earlier, and she was the only one that wasn't moving, still the same smile. She looked at peace. I don't remember exactly what I was whispering at that moment, but we were both freaking out. We heard some scratching noise. Long, dirty hands with sharp nails, almost inhumans, were piercing the pictures and paintings. The eyes of the people were becoming all black, and their jaws were opening more than humanly possible as they kept on repeating her name. The hands were all getting closer from us. We were now touching one another, completely surrounded by those hands. Then, they moved way faster, and a lot of them got their nails right into Elizabeth's skin and pierced it while descending all over her body. She screamed loudly out of pain. It was a terrifying scream. All the hands got to their pictures and back inside of it while closing what they pierced. Soon, the pictures and paintings were back to normal, but Elizabeth was bleeding from all over her body and was on the floor crying. I got to her level and tried as much as possible to reassure her, but I wasn't very effective as I was myself in shock and terrified. We heard the owner walk towards us. What's happening to you too? I heard screams. Are you okay? She entered the hallway and saw the scene. She looked completely shocked. But what happened? She asked. Both of us were unable to answer to her. We had no idea what to say that wouldn't make us sound crazy, so we just looked at her with whatever faces we were making at that moment. She didn't wait long and went to take a first aid kit. She sat down and put some bandages all over Elizabeth, as I was reflecting on what happened. When she was done, we both wanted to leave, so we said that we had what we needed for now. She looked sorry and packed some cookies for each of us. As we opened the door to leave, she articulated one last phrase. I hope you'll come back. She had a look and a tone of sadness. We got out and were now on the street. We both looked at each other. She was covered in bands like she got into a huge fight. I started to speak, but she lifted her hand. Not today. Another one, she said. I'll see you at school. And she left. I got on my way too and gave one last look to the house. The old owner was watching me from her window, and I couldn't tell what her expression was. I was too tired, so I ignored it and went back to my house. I'm posting this now that I'm back at home. I have no news of Elizabeth, but she did add me on Instagram, so I have no idea what I should do now. I have so many questions, so if anyone has any theories, I'll take it. I'm also open to questions, of course. Fourth story. Watching for Wendigos. Don't aim between the eyes, princess, he said. I peered through the night scope at the shapes coming out of the woods. Their brain pan is short, like a bear's. If you hit him between the eyes, you'll just part his hair and piss him off. Aim for the nose. Months ago, something changed. Wendigos weren't hunting solo anymore. Instead, they were hunting in packs. They got my mom and my little brother within just a few days of each other. That happened only 3 weeks ago, and I still dreamed about my mother screaming for help. I didn't dream of my brother. I just saw him everywhere, blood in his hair, frightened tears running down his cheeks. The Wendigos surrounded my mother on 3 sides. The only way for her to run was toward the side of the house where there was no door. They backed her up and overcame her. My brother was just too far from the house. 2 Wendigos knocked him down and ripped him apart. Following that, Dad and I lived in the metal bunker. During daytime, it was safe to go out and collect wood or water or empty buckets of whatever. We had plenty of ammo and 3 rifles. At night, we would turn off the lantern and put out any lit candles. Then we would sit by the gun slits and watch for Wendigos. After I watched one night, he said I was ready to start shooting. I balanced my rifle in the gun slit and watched through the scope. More Wendigos were slinking out of the woods. The radio Dad left on in the house had their attention, but one of the Wendigos lifted his snout to smell. He could probably smell my scent wafting out of the bunker. I had his nose in the crosshairs. The blast knocked me down. I sprang up to see a crumpled body and Wendigos looking first at the body, then at the bunker. Dad got the next one. My next shot only staggered me a moment. Dad shot again. Wendigos can move fast, but 2 shooters alternating shooting and loading can bring down an easy dozen. We killed every member of that pack. In the morning, we got the small tractor out of the barn and stacked the dead bodies. We burned them, the pillar of smoke rising like a smoke signal to any other Wendigo pack. Come here. Die here. That was my last summer with Dad. I was 14 years old. I learned how to shoot, how to drive, how to stack M and burn M. I show no mercy, because when I was 14 years old, Wendigos followed my dad to town and tore him to pieces. Daylight didn't save him. Nightfall won't save them. Nothing will save them. I can cry and drive, bringing extinction with me. 5th story. Beware of grunting noises in the winter. I'm old. 87 to be exact. I didn't know Reddit existed until last Tuesday, when my orderly sat down at my bedside and started scrolling. To be honest, I don't like it when they do that. They say everybody does it nowadays, but I think one should look another person in the eye when they're having a conversation. Anyway, I learned how to use a laptop a few years ago. I don't have any relatives, and since one need to be online these days to do anything at all, I decided to learn how to use a computer and how to be online. And now I'm about to die. They say it's cancer, but it doesn't matter. I'm old and I'm dying. Simple. I'm almost ready for it too. It's just that I have a story to tell and no one to tell it to. So I'll write it here if that's all right. When I was a young boy, I lived with my parents up in the north where my father worked at a sawmill. As his father did before him, and actually even his father before him. The winters were long, and if we got a lot of snow during the coldest months, we had trouble getting anywhere. One day, my grandmother Elisa died, and of course it was during those cold months. We couldn't bury her at the cemetery since we couldn't get to the cemetery. And the ground frost made it impossible to bury her anywhere in the ground where we could get to. So we built a snow mausoleum and put her in it as a temporary solution. That was a mistake. I don't know what we should have done, but what we did was not right. In the night that followed, I woke up and the house was pitch black. Normally, we had some candles and a few paraffin lamps so that we weren't completely in the dark. But now it was pitch black, and not only that, it was also dead silent. Not one snore, not one squeaking bed. That's when I heard the grunting noises from outside. Grunting noises in the wilderness is normal. It can be anything from a badger to a moose or a bear if you're unlucky. So I actually found the grunting noises comforting since I was inside. It meant that I wasn't dreaming or going insane. I was still in my parents' house in the woods, safe and sound. But what I should have known then that I have realized later on is that there is no animal that is in its rut during the winter, and both badgers and bears hibernate during these cold months. So it is very unusual to hear animal grunting noises in the winter. But I didn't think of that then, since I felt that the grunting was not unusual, but rather interesting. I went downstairs to have a look. There I found the rest of my family, standing in the living room, looking out through the window. All of them dead silent and equally dead still. "What is happening?" I asked. Or rather, I tried to ask, but my father threw himself over me and gripped my entire jaw with his hands and covered my mouth. He looked me straight in the eyes with a stare that meant absolute panic. I looked at my mother that was still staring out the window, tears now running down her face. She did not make a sound. Everything was quiet. Even the grunting noises had stopped. My father, who saw that I understood the need to be quiet, let me go and raised himself up to look out the window. I did the same. It looked like a bear sitting in the spot where the mausoleum had stood. The building was completely ruined now, and in the midst of the remaining piles of snow it sat. But even though it was a clear night, it was hard to see any details because of the trees. One weird thing, though, was that it sat cross-legged. I could clearly see its knees poking out on both sides of it. It sat completely still, and it felt like it had its eyes fixed on us, like it was deciding what to do next. Then it got up and stood on its hind legs, and the moonlight hit its face. Everyone in the room held their breath. It looked like a bear, but it was smiling. I swear it was smiling. Not like an animal that you can see is happy. No, this was a real human-like smile. It was looking straight at us now, and I could feel vomit creeping up in my throat. My mother had started crying silently, and my dad held his arms around her in a way that looked like he was equally trying to comfort her and equally trying to muffle the little sound she made. The bear stood there for what felt like maybe 15 minutes, but was probably more like 3. Then it walked away, still on its hind legs. The next day, my father and grandfather walked out to the burial site to see what was left of it. Us children were not allowed near it, but since my mother was quite upset, I could easily sneak away. I hid near the site behind a large rock and heard my father and grandfather talking. "What shall we tell the others? Look at the trails. The thing dragged her with it when it left," my grandfather said solemnly. My father said nothing for a while, and then he said, "This was a hungry bear who has woken up too early. There is nothing else for it to eat now, so it came here. We will tell them that and forbid them from going outside after sundown." My grandfather said nothing in response, but I could tell he didn't like what my father had said. They shoveled all the remaining snow from the mausoleum into a big pile. That pile remained there until spring when it melted away. We had a proper funeral for Elisa, of course, but with an empty casket. They have always maintained that it was a bear, but I don't know. I know bears can sit cross-legged. I know they can walk on their hind legs. I know they can make funny faces, and I know they can grab things. I really don't know what I believe, but one thing I will say, beware of grunting noises in the winter. Whatever it was that night, it ate my grandmother's corpse.